I'm Rick Davis. I'm the president of this chapter of the Maine Genealogical Society. It's called the Wawenoc Chapter. And I'm glad to see all of you here today. And those of you on, where do I look? On Zoom. Today we have Nat Clifford, who's a member here, who's going to present his research, as he's done in the last several years, on his family that include a family association, I believe, in Britain, and other interesting findings here. So Nat, I'll just hand it off to you.
Great. I got wired. Can you hear me okay? All right. So this today's presentation is going to be one amateur's genealogical journey so far. And I'm the amateur. So there we go. I find it a little daunting to be up here where people like Rick and Dana, BJ from the State Society have all presented. So we'll see what comes of this. All right. So our journey today, I thought I'd talk a little bit about getting started in genealogy, touch on some ancestral tidbits, talk a little bit about being involved in a family history association, and then a little on genetic genealogy. So I'm not one of those guys that's had a lifelong interest in genealogy as a young person or anything else. In the late 1980s, my mom sent me this book. I was posted overseas at the US Embassy in Cairo, Egypt at the time. So this showed up in our mail. And I thought, huh, that's interesting. And I'm in my 30s, we're busy doing stuff. And I just, to be honest, didn't really have any interest, even though that's our name on the cover. I did get, mocked mercilessly, because when you're assigned to an embassy, all your mail is opened in the office. So everyone sees what you're getting. And, this shows up. It's like, oh, look at you. So the best thing I can say about this is I didn't lose the book. She had it actually signed by Hugh Clifford, who was the 13th Lord Clifford of Chudley in the UK. So that's like, there you go. So 20 years later, it's around 2009. I came back from Egypt. I met my wife, Lexa, there. She was assigned to the embassy a year after I was. We came back, got married, raised a family, had different assignments here and there, went back overseas for a period, came back. We were signed up to New York at one point, to the US mission there. And like many others, we came across the armor of George Clifford, 3rd Lord George Clifford of Cumberland. That's him, one of the Queen's favorites. He's got his little glove here. That's super important if you're into that stuff. Anyway, so, like thousands of other people, I thought, well, that'd be pretty cool to be related to him. And if you go on Ancestry, you can see thousands of people claiming that ancestry, but he had no male heirs. So that's kind of a problem. Anyway, so at about that time, I started a correspondence with Bill Marquis here in the USA and a fellow named G.J. Clifford in the UK. I learned about and joined the Clifford Association, which was a UK-based family history group that they had started in the mid-1980s. So the first thing I got involved with was doing the research of my paternal line for a thing called the National Society Sons of Colonial New England. I don't know if anybody's heard of this. It's sort of a, sort of a B-level family history thing, I think. And but they have this thing, and they said, if you can claim ancestry back to pre-revolutionary times, you get to be in our society, right? So it's a, in hindsight, a kind of a silly thing to do, but for an amateur genealogist, I thought, well, this is good. So I learned the rigors of finding records. What's the difference between a primary and secondary source and things of that nature? So I thought, that was a helpful thing to do at the time. So that's kind of how I got started. What I'd like to do now is just share some ancestral tidbits. And I don't know about you, but what's striking to me when we start digging into genealogy is the amazing number of directions we can go in. You can quickly get buried in some morass of connections, and you kind of lose your place and what you're talking about. So what I thought would be good is we'll just talk about my four grandparents, their paternal ancestors, and see what we can pull out of that and maybe touch on a couple of topics. While we do that, I have four themes in mind. One is it's good to have connections. Second, this is kind of like Jeopardy. Second one is how legacy sometimes manifests itself differently than we might think. Entrepreneurship. And lastly, success and tragedy. So let's see, starting with my grandmother, Jeanette Hume. Her paternal immigrant ancestor was a fellow named George Hume, who was born in Scotland. And that's his line. Basically, the Humes, from that point when he arrived in Virginia up until her time, mostly were in the Virginia and Washington, D.C. area. She ended up living in Cape Elizabeth, Maine later in life. So here's George Hume, the immigrant ancestor. He's born 1698, died 1760. He was born in Wedderburn Castle, Scotland. That's not it, because they built that in 1770, but they built it over what was there previously. It would have been a much smaller castle, still belonging to the Lord Hume of the time. But anyway, so he got involved with his father and his uncle in the Jacobite Rebellion, supporting the Stuart clan, claimed to the throne after the expulsion of James II in 1688. So at the ripe old age of 17, he was captured along with his father and uncle, convicted, and sent to jail. The Hume family estates were confiscated. His uncle was banished to the colonies in 1715 and died shortly thereafter. And his father died, or was more likely killed, sometime around 1720. So young George was deported in 1721. So he, by this time, is 23 years old. And I'm presuming someone took, you thought this young guy, maybe he was misguided, father led him astray or whatever. So they put him on a ship to Virginia because, very convenient. In the UK, you have folks like this, just send them to America. He was put under the care of his cousin, who happened to be Governor Spotswood in Virginia, and who had remained loyal to the crown. His cousin got him into William and Mary, where he learned surveying. And so he became a royal surveyor. The story is that he mentored and trained a young George Washington in the surveying skills, and he's credited with laying out the present day city of Fredericksburg, Virginia. So there it is, but that's not his. This one was done in 1721 by two guys named Royston and Buckner. They laid out a plan for Fredericksburg 7 years before George came on the scene. After they had done this, the General Assembly in Virginia established the town of Fredericksburg and asked George, who by that time was the county surveyor, to lay out the town again in 1728. But his plat does not survive. So nobody knows whether he did anything with this of significance or whatever, but he's the one credited with laying out the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. So I think the story for George is it's really good to have family connections. If you can go from being a traitor to the crown to surviving and thriving in the new world and starting a family there, that's quite something, and good fortune. So let's see, who's over here? The K family. This is different manifestations of legacy. So James K emigrated from Rothwell, England to Oxford, Maine in 1729. He's the most recent of grandparents' paternal ancestors to come to the United States or America at the time. So he came and worked at the wool mill there, Robinson Woolen Mill, I believe it is, because of course he had those skills from his hometown and everyone was leaving at the time, And so he and his wife Lillian, he married after he got here and set himself up. So they had 9 children who survived into adulthood. 7 of them married, but 5 had no children of their own. The other 2 had 4 girls, one of which was my mom over there. And in 1984, the last surviving child, who was Mary Kay, passed away. 1984, excuse me. So that's sort of the end of the Kay line. I mean, if one's focused on male heirs because they carry the name or whatever, but that was kind of it. And they all, boy, they stayed in Oxford. And if they went away, they came back because they're all buried up there. The ones that survived, there was some unfortunate stories of injuries in the First World War. And so it's kind of a unfortunate thing for a lot of them, but they muddled through. So for the Kay family, here's their legacy. This is the Kay house in Oxford, Maine, which is now the Historical Society for the town of Oxford. After Mary passed, the surviving descendants, who were Mary Martin, Betty Shea, and my mom, Greta Clifford, who were the inheritors of the Kay things, they donated the home to the town of Oxford to be used by the Historical Society. And they had included in there, if Oxford didn't want to do that, sell the home and provide education for kids, but it's still there, and it's a thriving historical society. So also as part of that, with Mary's passing in 1984 and distributing the family assets, there was one other piece that came about, and that's this pickup truck. So my mom, I had left home at the time, but my mom somehow acquired this, and she was living in Cape Elizabeth at the time. So this pickup truck was belonged to the Kay family, was bought by Albert, but since Mary was the last surviving member of that family, she was the one driving it around, I presume, at the time. And so my mom said, "Oh yeah, that's Aunt Mary. That truck is Aunt Mary." So that's how she referred to it. I said, "Okay, that sounds good." So anyway, that truck is now in Belfast. And so if you happen to be going out to the transfer station, give us a wave. And if you see us pulled over to the side of the road with a hood up, yes, please, that'd be great. So it's just, sometimes a family's legacy manifests itself a little differently than we might expect. So let's see, who's this? Ralph Gould. He's my mom's father's side, and so this will be talking a little bit about entrepreneurship. He was got interested in genealogy as a young man, and he shared that his family tried to dissuade him. He said it's not really a proper thing for a young man to be lurking around cemeteries, going into town halls, asking a lot of questions. He did it anyway. That was kind of his mode. And so he had dug into his family history, got a little ways back, linked up with a gentleman out in Washington State, also a Gould, and they had, at the time, the Detroit Historical Society, don't ask me why, was vibrant and thriving and publishing all sorts of genealogical work. And so that collaboration resulted in them both getting back to this gentleman, Robert Gould, who was a sea captain back in the 1600s, and he was born in 1645 and was going back and forth from England to the New World, and finally settled in Hull in Massachusetts. And so that family has bounced around between Massachusetts and Maine since that time. So 2 people I'd like to talk quickly about are Henry Gould and then Ralph himself. This is just a sheet Ralph had done back in the late 60s when he found out that his grandfather, Henry Gould, who he had found really difficult to trace. He was doing genealogy and he couldn't figure out what's up with Henry. No one wants to talk about him. And then one Thanksgiving dinner, someone let the cat out of the bag. Henry had gone to prison. He was in Thomaston for some reason and he died there. So that was poor Henry's story. So Ralph let it go for about 20 years and then couldn't help himself and tried to figure out what happened to Henry. He wrote to every county court in Maine and asked them, did you convict a Henry Gould? And if so, what for? And he finally got answers back and started pulling things together, learned that he had indeed, been sent to Thomaston and whatnot. And so here's the letter he got from the prison at the time saying, yeah, he was a prisoner here. His number was 2784, yeah, and he died. But that's all we got because all the records were burned. So at some point, he also found the conviction sheet where the jury did convict him of, in this case, it was, well, firstly, he had been convicted of running a tippling house. That's not what this was about, but he, up in Ellsworth, Maine, and we're now talking the late 1800s, and in 1851, we remember the Maine law was passed, and that was prohibition of sales of alcohol. And it was the first, I didn't realize it was the first state law of that trend, temperance trend, to get passed in 1851, and it banned all manufacture and sale of alcohol. Then that was replaced with a slightly more lenient law because that wasn't working. So it allowed limited sale of alcohol. So you can imagine, all the loopholes and whatnot that people were working on. So he thought running a tippling house would be a great idea, but got caught at it twice. And then after that, he decided to go into the insurance business and was allegedly working for the Maine Mutual Accident and Insurance Company, where he apparently was getting premiums and then pocketing them and not sharing them with the company. There's some question whether the Maine Mutual Accident and Insurance Company even existed at the time. The dates of when that company was established, it's a little squirrely. In any event, there was some gentleman in Vanceboro gave him a $7 premium and then complained when he found out there was no insurance policy. And so a jury convicted him and sent him to jail. There's that conviction right there. And then he died a year later. He's 39 years old. So that's his sad story. So this is my grandfather, Ralph Gould, in his workshop in Cape Elizabeth, where he lived pretty much after he got married till the end of his life. And he had been a pretty successful guy running Gould Equipment Company in Portland, Maine, providing oil delivery equipment and pumps and all the things associated with, oil for a gas station or for fuel oil for our homes. And you can picture the 20s and the 30s. There was probably a lot of that going on. So he did a good job with that, but you'd never know it because he was such a modest guy. They never moved from this house that seemed quite small, raised 3 daughters there and everything. So, but bottom line, he was a far better example of entrepreneurship than his grandfather. The other thing he is probably better known, he was, you're probably familiar with John Gould, the writer and humorist in Maine, who wrote a column for different newspapers and so forth. They are apparently related as distant cousins through a shared great-great-grandfather with different moms, something like that. So, and they did correspond on occasion. But he, Eva Murray, who took over for John Gould doing a column in a magazine, I think it was called Maine Boats, Homes, and something, wrote about one of Ralph's escapades. He became known for the very well-timed and extensive and sometimes expensive practical joke. And there's one instance, I wasn't aware of this till I came across this article, he had a neighbor who was having trouble with a woodchuck, out in Cape Elizabeth. And it's hard to picture that now, Cape being sort of the way it is. But at the time, people had lots of space for gardens outside and all the rest of it. His neighbor was complaining about this woodchuck kept bugging him. So Ralph said, well, you need to trap him and then we'll take him away. So we did. And then the next day, a woodchuck, he showed up again. Ralph said, gosh, maybe he didn't take him far enough away. So he helped him trap the woodchuck, and they took him out to Cumberland, set him free, came back. Next day, the woodchuck's back. He came back from Cumberland. How'd he do that? Ralph got very serious and said, you're not taking him far enough away. Let's do this again. We'll trap him and we'll take him farther away. So he said, yeah, and now to make sure, because the guy was starting to question, is this the same woodchuck? And so Ralph got some purple paint, slathered it in the trap. They set it up, captured the woodchuck. It's covered in purple paint. And they drove it halfway to Sebago Lake, set it free. The next day, sure enough, in the guy's garden, there's a woodchuck slathered in purple paint that he had gone out and bought. So he carried on with this. I didn't know about that one, but he had one of his other things, he owed a guy $50. So we found $50 pieces, had them put in a steel tube, welded shut, put in a cabinet that he built in this workshop, sawed off all the screw heads, glued it together, put a very fine finish on it, and handed it to the guy and said, here you go, have a nice day. The only escapade I remember, if you recall the Prince of Fundy ferry that ran from Portland to Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, would depart several times a week. And Ralph had built this small runabout boat that was really, I think, designed for lakes because it didn't have much freeboard. Anyway, my mom and dad had ended up with it and they were puttering around Portland Harbor. So Ralph would say, come on, we're going out to serenade the Prince of Fundy as it departs. So it left at night. And so it's about 9 o'clock at night and we're in this little powerboat and he's standing up in the back trumpeting, serenading the Fundy as it goes off, which is, we all survived. The last memory I have of him is at his memorial service graveside at Spurwing Church in Cape Elizabeth. Not a very solemn affair, although many of us were crying at the time. And so he had arranged, his wife had passed away previously, so it was just him there, and he had arranged the whole thing. He wrote his own obituary. He decided who was going to be at the memorial service. There was going to be a small band. There would be hors d'oeuvres here, and they would be made of this and all the rest of it. And so we're there, and then it comes time to lower him into the hole, which was quite small. And it turns out he had designed his own PVC pipe cremation urn that was slowly lowered down. So that's how we said goodbye to Ralph Gould. Anyway, enough of that. Lastly, success and tragedy. This is the Clifford family. So let's see who we have here. Our earliest immigrant on the paternal side for the Cliffords is this guy named John Clifford. And he shows up in what is now New Hampshire in the mid-1600s. We don't know where he's from. With all the work that's been done for the Great Migration and all of that, all those volumes that have been cranked out, he's nowhere to be found. I'm convinced that wasn't his real name. But anyway, he shows up there. And so this side of the family, he bounces around New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and so forth. So there he is. This is the first indication of him there in Salisbury, Mass. He had a plot of land there. Then he gave that up and moved up to Hampton. And then from there came forward. So I wanted to talk about two guys in this line. The first one's John Henry Clifford, and then his son Arthur. John Henry was born in 1809. He became the Attorney General in Massachusetts in the mid-1800s, and then went on to become the governor, sort of in a windy way. He was part of the Whig Party, and they parlayed his popularity in a law case he had as Attorney General. He had run and won. And so they nominated him for governor, which he apparently reluctantly accepted. It was a difficult race because there was a presidential race at the time. There's a lot of stuff occurring that kind of we all are sort of familiar with. And then the state's temperance law raised its head, the Maine law. And so in addition to the Whig support, he was also nominated by another party opposed to the Maine law. His opponents were running with both free soil and pro-Maine law nominations. And the Whigs had been divided, and there was all this, this stuff coming on. So in a three-way race between him, Mann, and a Democrat, Henry Bishop, he received 45% of the vote, not enough to win the thing. So then in Massachusetts at the time, it got tossed over to the Senate, and he was elected by the state Senate 29-4. After one term, that was enough. He went back and became president of the Boston and Providence Railroad, and then ran a law practice. He apparently had a relationship with a chief justice in Massachusetts who knew Herman Melville and recounted a story, and somehow met up with him, recounted a story of one of his early cases. So Melville got back in touch with him, and so they corresponded a little bit, and he sent him some journal entries for the case. And Melville apparently wrote a story that was never published called The Isle of the Cross. So I don't know, that's his big thing. So the only other thing I remember finding out about him that was sort of interesting, his papers are at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and in there's a folder of his genealogical research, which in his case was primarily hiring a guy in London to find out where he came from. And at the time, I think if you've come across these things, there were folks over there very willing to take any American's money and give them sort of a sketch that bore pretty much no relation to reality, and saying, that guy George III, Lord of Cumberland, raises his head, and all the rest of it. So anyway, that was that. So there we go, sort of successful guy. His youngest son, Arthur Clifford. So Arthur goes on a European tour, 1872, goes to Harvard like all his brothers did. Cliffords have not been going to Harvard since that time. Then he goes to Dartmouth Medical School, becomes a general practitioner. In 1880, he marries this lovely lady, Kate Parsons, whose family is from Detroit. And I guess they're a well-off family in Detroit. This little snippet is just a piece of a thing that goes on for a whole page, describing all the lovely whatever that took place, and the 1,200 people that were there, and the 100 invited to the wedding, and lights and all of that lovely stuff. So they got married in February 1880. They did have a son, Charles, born October 1880. And the math kind of works out 9 months later. That's kind of cool. But then poor Arthur, he was sick, and he shot himself on a train while under the care of a doctor, which is a pretty mean feat. So he was under the care of this guy, and they were on their way back to the asylum. And the story says he had been partially insane. How do you do that? I don't know if it's a matter of degree. Clearly, that these things show up in the paper because his dad was a former governor, and not much time had passed since that time. It's just that's just a sad story, and he died just almost within a year. But luckily, he had a son, Charles, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this presentation. 1 year later. There's some indication that he got scared by caring for one of his brother's wives who was giving birth. He was the attending physician, and it's sort of, there's nothing's spelled out clearly in these accounts, but there's something bothered him about that, and maybe he lost his nerve. I don't know, but it's just a sad story. A young man who had everything going for him and just couldn't make it work. In my mind, the person that I think is the hero of the story is Kate Parsons, because she carried on. I don't think she ever married. She keeps showing up in the New Bedford, Mass, Boston area. She's living with relatives, raising Charles. and he goes on and thrives. And but being a female, boy, there's scant coverage of what's going on, as you all well know. And it's, but I think that's the interesting story, especially because in the 1890s, then you see her father showing up at the same asylum and dying and also having mental issues. So, I mean, what are the chances, huh? So that's it for the Cliffords, except a couple of other tidbits. We've come across from this line of people descending from John Clifford of Hampton, New Hampshire, a guy named Alfred Clifford, who's a distant cousin who was assigned to Bletchley Park during World War II and helped with that effort. And then here in Belfast, Ralph Clifford is in Grove Cemetery, and he's also from this same line. And his son just passed, yeah. So we're all over the place. Some Cliffords not part of this line, just two I'd want to mention. Some of you might remember Clark Clifford, confidant of presidents from Truman through Carter. Anyway, not a relative. And sadly, Stephanie Clifford is not a relative. That would have been an interesting one to track down. So that's it for those tidbits of ancestral nature. The other thing you'll sort of see running through this is what baffles me about genealogy is just all this data and what do we do with it? So this is something I tried 8 years ago to capture the first 5 generations of John Clifford's descendants, and then where did they end up? So they pretty much stayed put right here in the this southern part of New Hampshire, sort of dribbling up into what's now Vermont. Some came up to Maine. I don't think anybody got as far as Canada, but then one group, I don't know why they went down to Martha's Vineyard. That's my crew down there. I don't know, but then they left, so and came back. It's interesting that there's nobody in Boston, and I'm sure perhaps there were cultural or religious sensitivities that might have impacted that. But that's anyway, that's where they were for the first 5 generations. So continuing on the journey, I joined this thing called the Clifford Association, just a family history group. You might be members of some yourself. So here we are in Ugbrook in England. I had been assigned to the U.S. Embassy in London, and I went to my first gathering. This is 2011. There's Lord Clifford himself, no relation. His wife with a dog, very classic British situation here. This house also, Robert Adam had a hand in that. He had done the Humes thing up in Scotland about the same time, but so there we are. So at the next gathering, they'd have an annual get-together called a gathering. At the next one in 2012 up in Yorkshire, we were still in England at the time, and I had retired in place while Alexa finished up her tour of duty. So I lobbied for, they needed a new newsletter editor. So I had some time, and I thought, hey, I can do this. And so I lobbied for the position and put out my first edition the winter of 2012. This is a newsletter they've been putting out twice a year since the 1980s. And, being an American, we had grammar issues and how do you spell words like color and all the rest of it. But so we do that. And then immediately, little did I know it, I generated controversy by having this image on the cover. This is the wool barn of the Clifford family in Frampton, which was where we were going to have the next gathering, right? I thought, this is appropriate, generate interest. And all I got was, what are you doing putting a barn on the cover of our family newsletter? So anyway, I hope that I redeemed myself at least partially with the next issue. So there's Lady Anne Clifford. She's a hero to, all Cliffords because of her work. She's very much an early feminist and fought decades, with basically from the King of England on down to regain the property that her father was that George, with the glove and the hat and cover the book. He had left all his property to her uncle because he was the next male in line, and she argued that she should get it, you know, just because she's a woman. And she was ultimately successful. And in the area of Upper England in Yorkshire, very well renowned. She was a tough lady, and but you know, cared about the community and built up the region and whatnot. So anyway, she had there were 4 articles coincidentally about her in that issue, and I thought, well, that's a no-brainer. She goes on the cover. There we go. So no, I gave it up when we left because this is a British publication. You know, we get to receive a copy in the United States, but God forbid, you know. No, it's there's a gentleman taking it on since then. He's doing a great job. He lives in Southampton, and I think he's still using the same printer we found in London. So it's all good. Oh, there we are at the Wool Barn a year later. Different dog.
You're in that picture too somewhere?
Oh yeah, right there. Yeah. So there, a lot more people, well, the Wool Barn was popular and it was a newsletter. Yeah, exactly. Vindicated. Yeah. All right. Yeah, let's see, DNA. So, you know, where are we? 2012, I'm getting involved in this, talking to people, and DNA for genetic genealogy is getting more popular and more relevant. There's, you know, the technology's actually able to provide a little information. I think at the time, STR tests for Y DNA, which males carry, were up to 37, 67 markers, which was able to tell you a little stuff. So the Clifford surname the Clifford surname project is hosted by Family Tree DNA in Houston, which some of you may have dealt with. It's primarily a surname project following that name wherever it goes, but we have autosomal and mtDNA tests there also, if any of you have done those. So I'm now the administrator for this by sort of an accident. Bill Marquis had been running it, and I spoke to him 10 years ago, and we agreed that I would join him as a junior partner and learn about this and then take it on. And then sadly, he passed away before we could ever do any of that. So I kind of just took it over and struggling with keeping it going since that time. It's super interesting, but boy, I find it hard to keep up with the pace of change. And so there we are. And one thing I learned that we treat this as a hobby here in the US. You know, find your ancestors, it's all kind of harmless. Some people are finding their birth parents, and that's all good. But in the UK, it's a bit fraught because who you are comes with, depending on who you are, it comes with a lot of stuff. And if it turns out that you aren't who you think you are and someone else is, they get all the stuff. So there have been occasions where things have gotten a little bit tangled up. So they're a little goosey about doing this, and it permeates things. And so some people are reluctant to pursue testing. The whole thing gets a little bit of a bad reputation, but we carry on. So now we have Clifford's. Just to be clear, some had thought you know, we were all descended from this one guy, in our case, who would have come over with William the Conqueror. You know, there was a Clifford there coming over and doing that, but it's not the case because we have Clifford men spread across 4 major haplogroups, which are not related going back tens of thousands of years, way beyond genealogical time. So anyway, what's unfortunate is that people felt invested only in a family history group and whatnot, only to the invested, they were certain they were related in some fashion. And I would argue that you know, our affiliation is just because we share a surname, and that's pretty much it. And but we had people turn in their membership to say, well, no, my dad wasn't a thing, so I don't want to do it anymore. That's too bad. Anyway, so this is just something I've been doing more recently, trying to merge the DNA test in blue with traditional genealogy in the sort of reddish color. And over there on the far side is our New Hampshire branch, coming from John, the immigrant ancestor. And we've pretty much been able to describe anyone descended from him should have a particular haplogroup, which is great, because my hope is somebody somewhere is going to test and they'll be somewhere else and we'll be able to make that link back to Britain. And it, over the last 10 years, it hasn't happened yet, but you never know. And so that's our situation there. We did help one, the DNA was helpful for the one fellow over here who knew he was related, but couldn't, those last few blocks were hard, but just knowing that that was the link allowed him to go back and redouble his efforts and confirm that connection. So that's one place where it's been helpful. Over here, we have another branch of Clifford men who we are not related to. They're in a different haplogroup altogether, but they all share a particular haplogroup right here from a man who we don't know who that is. And their lines, none of them merge. Some of them are related down here, but all of these men have a common ancestor. We just don't know who that is. I am here. So this is my line. This is a guy named Roger. Wait, that's Roger, that's Rick. There's a couple of men here. Unfortunately, some of these gentlemen have passed away. And I don't know if you've run into this problem. If you're doing any DNA work, a really important thing is getting a beneficiary document sorted out, because those are kind of ghost test kits now. Then you can't, I mean, they exist, but they're legally, they belong to that person and whoever whoever's inherited their stuff. And I have in a couple of cases reached out to them, and if people aren't interested, they just don't want to be bothered. So, but for these folks, they're all related. We don't know how, but now it's up to them to make something of that. And that's where this often comes to a halt. Because I think people unfortunately think that this DNA thing will sort of give you all the answers, when in fact, it just shows you a particular path you might want to try, but there's still a lot of work to be done there. So like within the past few months, I've learned that Family Tree, if you use them, they're going to come out with a new tool that's going to do this, essentially. So this was a little bit of a kludge trying to pull all this together. I thought it would be helpful and carried some of these over to some of the gatherings in England. And anyway, so that's something that they're going to be doing. Right. Final thought. It's, in my opinion, what I've come to believe is that delving into this harmless vanity of looking at our ancestors, it sort of allows us to make connections we otherwise might not otherwise make. And whether you're learning about your own family or talking to people or whatever, it's interesting in that way and continues to be so wherever it leads. So I leave you with a question. Where's your journey taking you? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Nat. Okay, so I have a microphone if anyone has any questions for Nat.
Going back to what you first said, what was the name of that national society in,
Oh, geez.
it was
yeah.
way back in the beginning?
Yeah. Let me find it here. It was the National Society Sons of Colonial New England. I don't know if they're still extant, because I wrote them an email saying, hi, are you still there? You know, we do this thing, and are you still doing a newsletter? And when I last got a newsletter for them, the club or whatever you call it had $50,000 in assets. And it's like, so where are you guys? Anyway, I haven't heard back. I don't know. They are? Yeah, right. Exactly, with Henry. You know, we'll call up Henry, Henry will write back and say, ah, yes, no worries. Anyway, so yeah, that was that. It seems to me it was sort of like a male version of Colonial Danes or something like that. But it was that was my first experience trying to do legitimate genealogy with the proofs and all. You know what? Also, I found I for another time perhaps, but I went to a DNA convention, and the gentleman there was arguing that even DNA tests are secondary sources for genealogical purposes, that it's not proof positive of a particular thing, that you have to take it with those caveats, which is an interesting side note. Anyway.
Anyone else?
So is the younger generation interested in what you found?
Is the younger generation interested in what I found? Speaking for my particular family, no. But I hope, right? I was that 30-year-old guy and I got this book. I don't know, I think, isn't that all our hopes, that if our descendants have any interest at all, they may pick it up, when they have time. Right? We have time now. We can do things like this, and they're just raising families, working, and all the rest of it. There does seem to be a trend. I don't know if you've noticed it, that people of that same age are also not interested in things. Auntie has a bureau to pass on, and they no, thank you. And we had anyway, so it's sort of a common occurrence now, but maybe that'll change. This stuff's easier, right? It's just data. You can hold it on your computer or something. So hopefully.
So tell us about two of the brick walls you came across and how did you solve them?
Ooh. Okay, remember the title of this presentation was Amateur's Genealogical Journey. So I've hit brick walls, and I have not really the brick wall I have that I remain focused on is this John Clifford, who showed up in New Hampshire. And where did he come from? So there's a family of Cliffords in Bobbing Court, Kent, who died out about 10 years before he was born. And there were two sons that had 50-pound inheritances. The family dies out, never to be heard from again, in Kent, England. And then this guy, George, who is some believe is John's father, shows up in Massachusetts and so forth. So that's, I don't know, that's, as far as I'm concerned, how many guys were named George and John in England? So it's a bit of a stretch, but it's something worth pursuing. If there was another line, maybe an uncle back there that comes through and there's a male line that we could get a DNA test from, and it suggests that yes, that could have been maybe. So that's the big brick wall.
Does anyone have Zoom have a question? Typed anything in, so
Nope.
I don't think so. All right, thank you, Nat.
Hey, thanks for listening.